I stood in the yard of Gray Oak Farm with a hammer in one hand and the wooden sign in the other. The morning wind carried the smell of wet grass and cattle. I nailed the board to the gate post with 3 solid strikes, then stepped back to read it again. Owner of Gray Oak Farm seeks a wife. Must know horses, livestock, and life on the open range. No weaklings. I had written it myself the night before by lantern light. Some folk in Hereford would call me crude for it. I didn't care. I wasn't looking for a pretty face to sit by the hearth. I needed a partner who could ride at dawn, keep ledgers straight, and stand knee-deep in mud when the herd needed moving. The farm had grown too big for one man and 2 hired hands. My name is Warren Vale, 32 years old, unmarried, master of Gray Oak Farm on the northern edge of Hereford. My parents died of fever when I was barely 20. I took the stretch of wild land they left me and turned it into something real. Solid stables, strong fences, wide pastures, a clear stream, and a herd of over 40 head of cattle. Bren and Tomas worked hard, but the days were long and the work never ended. I needed someone who could share the weight, not just the name. 3 days passed. I was in the yard repairing harness straps when I heard hooves, not the slow clop of a town horse, but the quick, sure rhythm of a mountain breed. I looked up. A tall orc woman rode through the open gate. She sat straight in the saddle, shoulders broad under an old travel cloak the color of storm clouds. Her black hair was braided tight against her scalp. A small hunting knife rested at her hip. The horse beneath her was a big gray gelding, the kind that fought the bit and tested every rider. She guided him with nothing more than the pressure of her knees and a slight shift of weight. The animal obeyed as if it had known her all its life. She stopped a few paces from me, her golden eyes flicked to the sign, then back to my face. "I heard you're looking for a wife who can ride," she said. Her voice was low, clear, and carried the faint accent of the northern hills. I stared at her. Not with scorn, but with honest surprise. An orc woman asking to be a farmer's wife was something the whole town would talk about for months. Bren, who had been mending a fence behind the stable, let out a loud bark of laughter and didn't even try to hide it. I wiped my hands on my trousers and answered, "If you're better than me, we'll talk." The orc woman didn't smile. She simply asked, "Race, rope, or drive cattle?" I realized I had just challenged the wrong person. She swung down from the saddle in one smooth motion. Up close, she was even taller than I had thought, nearly a head above me, built like someone who had spent her life working and fighting. She took the rope from the post where I had left it, tested its weight, then walked to the practice post I used for roping drills. I threw first. 3 clean loops around the wooden steer in 3 beats of my heart. Not bad. I had done it 1,000 times. She stepped up, rolled her wrist once, and sent the rope flying. The loop settled perfectly over both horns of the post. Then she mounted again, circled the yard at a trot, and dropped 2 more loops, one around each of the 2 distant posts, without missing. Bren stopped laughing. Tomas, who had wandered over from the hay shed, muttered, "She wasn't born on a horse. She was born on the wind." She dismounted and handed the rope back to me. Dust clung to the hem of her cloak, but her breathing was steady. "My name is Dalara Varkesh," she said. "I used to live at the horse camps of Kardun. My father died in a blood debt feud between clans. I left with nothing but the clothes on my back and the skills in my hands. I have no dowry, no family to speak for me, but I can ride, rope, keep accounts, and work from before dawn until after dark. I don't need to be fed. I need a place to build a new life." I studied her for a long moment. The wind tugged at her cloak. Her yellow eyes never wavered. I led her inside the house. The main room smelled of wood smoke and yesterday's stew. I poured 2 cups of water from the jug and set one in front of her. "This farm is not easy," I told her. "I can't promise riches. I need someone who will work beside me, suffer beside me, and stand when the weather turns ugly." Dalara drank, then set the cup down carefully. "I didn't come for sweet words," she replied. "I need a roof, a name, and the right to prove I'm not useless." Her honesty hit me harder than any insult ever could. I respected it. I said, "Tomorrow, if you still want this, we'll ride to the stone chapel and sign the marriage contract." Dalara extended her hand across the table the way men seal a cattle deal. "Then from tomorrow, I will do my share." I took her hand. Her grip was strong, calloused, and warm. For the first time since I had nailed that sign to the gate, I felt something shift inside my chest. I told myself this was only a practical arrangement, a business deal between 2 people who needed each other. I had no idea that the orc woman standing in my kitchen would soon ride straight into the center of my life and change everything I thought I knew about strength, about marriage, and about myself. The next morning, we rode to the small stone chapel at the edge of Hereford. The ceremony was as plain as the wooden benches inside. No flowers, no music, no guests except Bren and Thomas standing awkwardly by the door, and the old priest who had known me since I was a boy. Sunlight slanted through the narrow windows and fell across Delara's shoulders as she stood beside me. When the priest asked if she took me willingly, Delara answered without hesitation, her voice steady and clear in the quiet stone room. Yes. Because I choose. I glanced at her. She wasn't looking at the floor or twisting her hands. She looked straight ahead, as if the words mattered. I repeated my own vows the same way. The priest bound our hands with a strip of plain leather, spoke the old words, and it was done. We were married. We rode back to Grey Oak Farm in silence. The wind moved through the long grass, and the cattle watched us pass. When we reached the house, I showed her every room, the large kitchen with its wide hearth, the storeroom, the small office where I kept the ledgers, and the 2 sleeping chambers that faced each other across the narrow hall. I stopped at the eastern room, the one with the morning light. This one is yours, I said. There's a bolt on the inside of the door. Delara looked at the iron bolt longer than she looked at the bed. Then she turned to me. You're not making me sleep in your room? We've known each other 2 days, I answered. I need a wife, not a prisoner. Something in her golden eyes softened, just a fraction. She gave a small nod. Before dawn the following morning, I woke to the sound of movement in the yard. I pulled on my boots and stepped outside. Delara was already at the stables. She had braided her hair high, put on plain work clothes, and was checking the hooves of the mare I called Syrah. Bren, who usually rose first, stood at the stable door with his mouth half open. I asked her, "Did you sleep?" "Enough to work," she replied, tightening a strap. She chose Sarah for herself, swung into the saddle, and rode out to the north pasture as if she had lived on this land all her life. I watched her go, the first light catching on her cloak, and felt an odd tightness in my chest that I couldn't name. That day we moved the herd to the northern grazing ground. One young bull broke away and charged toward the rocky ravine. Bren started after him, but Delara was already moving. She didn't shout or whip her horse. She cut across at an angle, used her weight and the mare's speed, and turned the bull back toward the herd with clean, calm pressure. The animal obeyed, as though it had been waiting for her command. Later, while we rested the horses, Bren muttered to me, "Boss, she drives cattle better than I do." Tomas added, "And she ropes better than you." I answered simply, "I know." Delara heard us. She kept her eyes on the cinch she was adjusting, but the tip of one pointed ear twitched. The only sign I had learned meant she was pleased. In the afternoon, she went through the storeroom and the ledgers without being asked. She moved sacks of flour that had been stored too close to the damp wall, noted that the salt had been bought at too high a price, replaced the frayed ropes with better ones from the back shelf, and pointed out 2 missing entries in the cattle sales book. She didn't scold. She simply set everything right and said, "If you want the farm to grow, you need to know where every copper goes." I laughed once, short and surprised. "So from now on, you keep the books?" She looked at me directly. "If you're smart enough to hand them over." That evening, we ate at the same table. Delara sat straight, spoke little, but watched everything. I still didn't know whether to treat her as wife, guest, or partner. At the end of the meal, she asked quietly, "Do you regret it?" I met her eyes. "Because I married an orc woman? No. I regret challenging you to prove you were better than me. The whole farm will be laughing about that for years." For the first time since she had arrived, Delara smiled. It was small but real. That night, I lay in my own room and listened to the sounds of the house. I heard her moving quietly, adding wood to the kitchen fire, straightening the curtains by the window, stacking the bowls neatly on the shelf. The place had always been only a roof and 4 walls to me, somewhere to sleep after the day's work. Now it felt different, warmer, alive. I told myself again that this was still just a practical marriage, a fair exchange between 2 people who needed each other's skills. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw her riding Syrah across the open pasture at first light, cloak flapping behind her like a banner, and I began to doubt my own words. The first few weeks passed in a rhythm I had never known before. Every morning before the sun cleared the eastern hills, Delara was already at the stables. She checked the horses while I walked the cattle lines. Bren mended fences and Tomas hauled hay. At dusk, we sat together at the table with the ledgers open between us, planning how many more head we could add before winter and how much extra fodder the north pasture would yield. We began to speak of the farm as ours instead of mine. The word slipped out naturally, and neither of us corrected it. In the far stall stood a young gray stallion we called Tan Sam. He had thrown 3 men already and nearly broken one's leg. I had decided to sell him at the next market. Delara asked for a chance to try him first. She did not force the horse. Each day she simply entered his stall, stood at a respectful distance, and spoke to him in low, steady tones. She let him smell her hands, let him watch her move. She brought him fresh water and clean straw without asking for anything in return. On the 7th day he allowed her to touch his neck. On the 15th day she placed the saddle on his back and he stood still. By the end of the month she rode him in slow circles around the training yard while I stood outside the rail and forgot to breathe. I watched the way the big gray moved under her as if he had been waiting for exactly her weight and exactly her hands. Delara did not break horses. She listened to them until they chose to follow. I began to see her differently. She was not beautiful in the soft, town girl way the men in Hereford praised. She was beautiful like the wind that swept the open range, like the steady fire in the hearth on a freezing night, like rough hands that could gentle a frightened animal or mend a broken fence before breakfast. I started waiting for the sound of her boots on the porch when she came in for supper. I started remembering the exact pitch of her voice when she spoke to the horses. I started wanting to tell her things I had never told anyone. When we rode into town together to buy supplies, the whispers followed us like dust. People stared at Delara's green skin and tall frame. One leather merchant at the market square sneered loud enough for half the street to hear. Warren Vale bought himself an Ork brood mare to keep his barn warm. I moved before I thought. My hand closed around the front of his shirt and I slammed him back against the wooden post of his stall. The man's eyes widened in fear. Delara's voice came from behind me, calm and firm. "Don't hit him for me, Warren." I let go. The merchant stumbled, gasping. I spoke loud enough for every ear in the square. "Anyone who insults my wife will find that Gray Oak Farm no longer buys from them. Not a single hide, not a single nail." The market fell quiet. Delara said nothing more, but when we rode home, she stayed closer to my side than usual. That night, a different kind of trouble came. I woke to the sound of breaking wood and nervous horses. Delara was already on her feet, pulling on her boots. We ran to the stables together. 3 masked men had forced the gate open and were leading out our best animals, Sarah and Tanzam among them. I grabbed the crossbow from the wall. Delara snatched a rope from the post. Before I could even aim, she spun the loop once and cast it. The rope caught the nearest thief around the chest and yanked him clean off his horse. He hit the ground hard. The other 2 panicked and fled, but one of them tossed a burning bundle of straw into the nearest stall as he ran. Flames licked up the dry hay in seconds. The horses screamed and kicked against their doors. Delara did not hesitate. She ran straight into the smoke. "Delara!" I shouted. She did not answer. She threw open stall after stall, slapping rumps, guiding panicked animals toward the open yard. I followed her, coughing, pulling out the last 2 mares while the roof beams began to groan. When I finally dragged her clear of the burning building, her hair was singed, her sleeves blackened, and her left hand was blistered from grabbing a red-hot latch. I sat her down on the grass and tore a strip from my own shirt to wrap the burn. My hands would not stop shaking. Delara looked up at me through the haze of smoke still drifting from the stables. "You're trembling," she said. "Are you that afraid of losing the horses?" I stared at the raw skin of her palm, at the soot streaked across her cheek, at the Ork woman who had just run into fire for animals that were not even hers a month ago. "No," I answered, my voice rough. "I'm afraid of losing you." She was quiet for a long time. The only sound was the crackle of the dying fire and the nervous stamping of the rescued horses. Then she reached out with her uninjured hand and laid it over mine. Her grip was steady, warm, and certain. From that night on, whatever we had started as, a contract, a bargain, a practical arrangement, changed. It was no longer just a marriage on paper. It was something deeper, something that had begun to grow roots while we were both too busy working to notice. The morning after the fire, the air still smelled of wet ash and scorched wood. We walked the yard while the sky was still gray. Bren found a strange horseshoe half buried in the mud near the broken gate. Tomas picked up a torn scrap of red cloth caught on the fence. I turned over a broken knife and saw the mark carved into the hilt, a coiled snake. Bren's face hardened. Morik, tail snake, half orc, half man, runs the biggest horse-thieving crew on the border. He only goes after farms with good bloodlines. Then Zam is famous now because Delara broke him. They'll be back. I looked at Delara. Her bandaged hand rested on the hilt of her knife, but her eyes were calm. I want you to stay in town for a few days, I said, or at least inside the house. Let us handle this. She turned to me slowly. The golden light of dawn caught the sharp line of her jaw. You want to hide me, Warren? The words were quiet, but they cut. I realized at once how they sounded. Like I was ashamed of her, like I thought an orc wife was something to keep out of sight when trouble came. No, I said quickly, I want you safe. Delara shook her head once. This farm is mine now too. If danger comes to our door, I stand here with you, not behind you. I understood then that I had made a mistake. She did not need to be protected like fragile glass. She needed to be trusted like steel. So we planned together. Delara moved the best horses to the hidden corral behind the hill. She set small bells along the fence lines so the slightest touch would ring. She showed us where to dig shallow pits covered with brush near the western approach. She spent hours with Thon Zam in the training yard, teaching him to stay steady even when fire roared and ropes flew. Bren watched her and muttered, I thought the boss just married a wife. Turns out the farm married a general. 3 nights later, the bells woke us. I grabbed the crossbow. Delara was already swinging onto Thon Zam's back, rope coiled at her hip. We moved without words. Bren and Tomas took positions behind the main stable. I crouched near the hayshed. Delara rode up the hill and waited in the shadows like a ghost. 6 riders came over the ridge. Morik himself led them, broad, scarred, a half-orc with a snake tattoo running down his neck. They thought we were still shaken from the first raid. They were wrong. The bells sang the moment their horses crossed the fence. Delara came down the slope like thunder made flesh. Then Zam's hooves barely seemed to touch the ground. She did not charge straight at them. She cut across their escape route, rope spinning above her head. Morak laughed when he saw her. A wife playing guard dog for her human master? Delara's voice rang clear across the yard. No, I am one of the masters here. She cast the rope. The loop snapped around Morak's right wrist. She spun then Zam hard. The big gray planted his feet and yanked. Morik flew from the saddle and slammed into the mud of the pit we had dug the day before. His men shouted and drew weapons, but Bren and Thomas were already on them. I stepped out with the crossbow leveled at Morik's chest. Move again, I said, and the next bolt goes through your throat. They surrendered. We bound every man with their own ropes and kept watch until dawn. In the morning, we rode the whole group into Hereford and handed them to the town guard with the burned stable as proof. The captain listened to the story, then looked at Delara standing tall beside me in her soot-stained cloak. Your farm was lucky to have her, he told me. I looked at Delara and answered without hesitation, no, I'm the one who's lucky to have her. She said nothing, but under the edge of her cloak, her fingers found mine and squeezed once, hard and warm. That evening, we stood together by the newly repaired stable. The smell of fresh timber and pine tar filled the air. Lantern light swayed above the doors. I leaned against the rail and spoke the truth I had been carrying since the night she ran into the flames. I set out looking for a wife who could ride. Delara turned to me, the lantern painted gold across her green skin and the faint scars on her arms. And what did you find? I met her eyes and did not look away. I found someone better than me, and that is the greatest piece of luck I have ever had in my life. For a moment, the only sound was the soft shifting of horses inside the stable. Then Delara stepped closer. I reached up, cupped the side of her face with one hand, and kissed her, properly, fully, the way a husband kisses a wife he has chosen with his whole heart. She tasted of smoke and salt and the open wind. When we drew apart, she rested her forehead against mine. The farm around us was quiet and safe for the first time in many nights, and for the first time since I had nailed that sign to the gate, I knew without any doubt that the orc woman who had answered my challenge had become far more than a partner in work. She had become the heart of everything I owned and everything I wanted to build. The weeks after Morik's capture passed in a kind of quiet victory. The town guard dragged him and his men away in chains, and word spread faster than any wildfire. Grey Oak Farm was no longer just another holding on the northern edge of Hereford. People began calling it the place where the orc wife caught the horse thieves. Delara no longer walked through the market as the strange green woman Warren Vale had married out of desperation. They called her Delara of Grey Oak now, and when she rode through the square on Tanzam, heads turned with respect instead of whispers. Our marriage changed in small, careful steps. We still kept our separate rooms for a while, not because we feared each other, but because we had started this as strangers, and neither of us wanted to rush what had begun to feel important. One cold autumn night, after we had finished checking the herd and the wind howled around the eaves, Delara stopped outside my door. She stood there for a long moment, lantern light painting her face in soft gold. "I don't want to be a wife on paper anymore," she said quietly. I set down the harness I had been oiling and looked at her. "Neither do I." That night the house stopped feeling like two separate lives sharing the same roof, and it became ours. We moved slowly, learning each other the same way she had learned the horses, without force, with patience and trust. Some mornings I woke to find her already gone to the stables, but now she left the scent of her hair on the pillow and the memory of her hand resting on my chest. Some evenings I pulled her close by the fire, and we talked about the day, about the future, about nothing at all. The practical arrangement we had signed in the stone chapel had grown roots deeper than either of us had expected. The farm grew with us. Delara started a small training yard behind the East Ridge. Word traveled along the border roads, and soon riders arrived from human villages, orc camps, and even dwarven trading caravans, leading difficult horses that no one else could handle. She took them in, worked with them the same way she had worked with Tanzam, quietly, steadily, until the animals chose to trust her. I watched her teach a stubborn black stallion to accept a saddle in under 2 weeks, and felt something fierce and proud rise in my chest. We bought more land, built 2 new barns, and hired 3 more hands who quickly learned that Delara's word carried the same weight as mine. Bren and Tomas no longer worked for Warren Vale alone. They worked for both of us. Not everyone accepted the change. One spring day, a wealthy noble from the southern city rode in with a string of fine horses he wanted trained. When he saw Delara walking out of the stable, he sneered and said, "I wish to speak with the true master of the farm." I stepped forward, but Delara placed a hand on my arm and answered before I could speak. "You are looking at her." She named her price, 20% higher than we usually charged. The noble laughed at first, then saw the look in her eyes and the way Tanzam stood calm and powerful behind her. He paid. When he rode away, Delara turned to me with the faintest smile. "Too much?" she asked. I shook my head. "You charged him exactly what he deserved." In the second spring of our marriage, Delara came to me in the kitchen while I was sharpening knives. She stood in the doorway, hands resting lightly on her belly, and said the words I had begun to hope for without daring to say them aloud. "I'm carrying our child." I stood frozen with a whetstone in one hand and a blade in the other. For a long moment I could not speak. Then I crossed the room and pulled her gently against me, careful as if she were made of morning mist. "Are you afraid?" she whispered against my shoulder. "Terrified," I admitted, "but happier than I have ever been in my life. Our daughter was born on a clear night when the stars seemed close enough to touch. We named her Mira Vale. She came into the world with her mother's golden eyes and a cry loud enough to wake the cattle. From the first week she was fearless around horses. Delara would carry her out to the training yard in a sling across her chest, and Mira would watch everything with wide, curious eyes. One afternoon, not yet 2 years old, she reached out and patted Tanzam's nose without a trace of fear. Delara laughed softly and looked at me across the rail. "She will ride before she can write her own name." I smiled and answered, "Then I had better prepare myself. She is your daughter, after all." The years rolled on like the seasons across the open range. Gray Oak Farm became more than a place where cattle grazed and horses were trained. It became a small bridge between two peoples who had spent centuries glaring at each other across the border. Orc warriors who had grown tired of endless clan feuds came looking for honest work. Human families who had lost everything in raids found steady wages and fair treatment. Children, some fully human, some fully orc, some both, ran laughing between the barns. No one was turned away because of the color of their skin or the shape of their tusks. The only rule was simple: work hard and treat the land and each other with respect. One quiet evening many years later, Delara and I stood on the hill overlooking the farm. The sun was setting behind the western ridges, painting the pastures gold in long shadows across the new barns. Mira, now tall and strong, like her mother, was teaching a group of young riders how to rope a moving target. Laughter drifted up on the wind. I slipped my arm around Delara's waist and pulled her close. "It started with a sign on a gate," I said, "and a challenge I never should have made." Delara leaned her head against my shoulder. "You told me that if I was better than you, we would talk. I was better, and you kept your word." I turned her to face me. The years had added silver to the black in her braid and fine lines at the corners of her eyes. But she was still the same woman who had ridden up to my gate and changed everything with a single question. "I went looking for a wife who could ride," I told her. "I found someone who could ride better than me, work harder than me, and love me better than I ever knew how to ask for. You didn't just save the farm, Delara. You saved me from living half a life." She reached up and brushed her fingers along my jaw the way she had done 1,000 times. "And you gave me a home when I had none," she said. "You gave me a name I could be proud of. You gave me a daughter who will never have to choose between two worlds because we made one together." We stood there as the sky turned deep violet and the first stars appeared. Below us, the lights of the farm glowed warm in the windows. Horses moved quietly in the paddocks. Somewhere, a child laughed. The story had begun when an orc woman rode up to my gate and asked, "I heard you're looking for a wife who can ride." I had answered with proud, foolish words, "If you're better than me, we'll talk." She had not only been better, she had been everything, and every day since I have thanked whatever fate or stubborn luck brought her to my door. Because the woman who answered my challenge did more than prove she could ride and rope and run a farm. She proved that a marriage begun in practicality could grow into the deepest love a man could ever know. She proved that two people from opposite worlds could build something stronger than either of them had ever dreamed. She proved that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is open the gate when the right stranger knocks,